The reading of the Lord, Deuteronomy 15:4, 7 through 11. There should be no poor among you, for the Lord your God will greatly bless you in the land he is giving you as a special possession. But if there are any poor Israelites in your towns, when you arrive in the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Instead, be generous and lend them whatever they need. Do not be mean-spirited and refuse someone a loan because the year of canceling debts is close at hand. If you refuse to make the loan and the needy person cries out to the Lord, you will be considered guilty of sin. Give generously to the poor, not grudgingly, for the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. There will always be some in the land who are poor. That is why I'm commanding you to share freely with the poor and with the other Israelites in need. Reading for the book of Matthew 26, 6 through 11. Meanwhile, Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon, a man who had previously had leprosy. While he was eating, a woman came in with a beautiful alabaster jar of expensive perfume and poured it over his head. The disciples were indignant when they saw this. "What a waste," they said. "It could have been sold for a high price and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, replied, "Why criticize this woman for doing such a good thing to me? You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Ruben. As we continue on with our sermon series for the summer, we are looking at Christianity and the problem of poverty. Mother Teresa said it best. We think sometimes that poverty is only being hungry, naked, and homeless. The poverty of being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for is the greatest poverty. We must start in our own homes to remedy this kind of poverty. For about 2 years, I had the wonderful opportunity and privilege to be a homeless chaplain at a local organization here in Corpus Christi. And I'll always remember my encounter. This isn't his name, but this is the name that I'll give him for privacy reasons. But I'll call him Jim. Jim was probably in his early 60s, but he really looked like if he was in his 80s, just from the life that he had lived. Jim did have some mental issues that he had dealt with throughout his life. And I'll always remember this about Jim, though, that he had the bluest eyes that I had ever seen. Throughout my conversations with Jim, we talked about his upbringing and his life. And of course, there were other times in which there was just no getting through, just depending on how he felt during that day. But I had learned to get to know Jim. One day on a way to staff meeting, I walked outside, and right before I turned the corner, I heard this person yelling, "Help me! Help me! Help me!" And as I turned the corner, I looked to my right to see where this distress was coming from, and there was Jim. Surrounding him were 2 police officers. And as I got closer, I noticed the reason why Jim was yelling for help. As I approached closer to him, his pants had fallen down, exposing himself. And the reason why they had fallen is because, well, Jim, because of his experiences, because of what he went through as a homeless person, being taken advantage of, was always afraid to be around others. And so what happened was that his pants fell because of the amount of feces that were within his pants. "Help me," he cried. And I went up to the police officer and said, I know this man, his name is Jim. And is there anything that I can do to help? And they said, please. We're trying to get him into the squad car, and whatever you want to do, please, by all means, do it. What was sad throughout this entire account is that people were driving by, honking their horns, slowing down so that they could take pictures of Jim, laugh at Jim, probably take videos of Jim. And then they would keep on driving by. So you could imagine what Jim was going through. And he just stood there with his arms to his side saying, help me. I enlisted the help of one of the medical guys there, and I said, let's help Jim. And said, Jim, I'm here to help you. And so we got a sheet, and we put it around Jim just to kind of give some privacy. And I remember I had to go and take some hand sanitizer, and I had to throw it underneath my nose because of the smell. And we took some medical shears, and we began to put some gloves on and began to cut away everything. And this is when I got a very good look of how it had just dried completely on his legs. Couldn't really tell from what was feces to his wrinkled skin. We helped Jim, got all that stuff taken care of, wiped him down as best that we could, had an ambulance come for him. They ended up taking him to the hospital. But what caused me to rush to Jim's aid? There were other people from the organization that did not. I was later told they weren't sure why I went and helped this man, because he was technically not on our property, although he was a foot away from it. That didn't stop me. The truth of the matter is that I had built a relationship with Jim. I didn't see Jim as a case number or a file to be filed away in a cabinet somewhere, but I saw Jim for who he was. He was a man who was made in the image of God. And as I reflect back on this incident with Jim, Jim was just like me. And as I cared for Jim, I was reminded of my own helpless and sinful spiritual state. I too remember crying for help on the street. Help me. Help me. Unable to move, unable to change my life. And Jesus turned the corner. He didn't stand afar, but he met me. He ran to me, and when he saw me in my poor state of a condition, he got to work and gently removed the soiled stench clothing of sin that wrapped my heart. And he took the time and cleansed me, cared for my wounds, and clothed me, because Jesus loved me. That may be your story as well. But be encouraged that Jesus loves you. You see, the greatest contributor to poverty is not a lack of money or resources. It is simply a lack of love and concern for others. A lack of love leads to poverty. We see this lack of love in the hearts of the disciples who grumbled over the woman who anointed Jesus with her alabaster box. These disciples were upset because this alabaster box that she broke over Jesus' head, it was a year's worth of wages, over 300 denarii, and she loved Jesus enough to take the most precious thing that she had to anoint Jesus. And the disciples, they weren't just annoyed. They were upset. They were angry over this. And the comment that was made, that it could have been used for the poor was made to question Jesus' lack of concern for the poor. The grumbling, more than likely, was started up by Judas, the betrayer of Jesus. We don't know this for sure, but John gives us a clue in his own gospel in chapter 14, verse 6. In John's account, Judas is angered and says this could have been given to the poor, and Jesus gives him the same response. Matthew's gospel reads, and John tells us that Judas really didn't care for the poor, because why? He was a thief, a handler of the finances, and Judas was just hoping to make some extra denarii for himself. If you keep reading on through Matthew, you'll also see that within the very next verses, Judas is so angry that this is where he goes to find the leading priest, asking, "How much will you pay me to betray Jesus?" Jesus' words, "You'll always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me," caused controversy then, and it still causes controversy now. People have utilized Jesus' quote that caring for those in need is a secondary concern. Some may use this passage as justification to be tight-fitted. But Jesus' message is actually the opposite. Jesus, yes, was in fact rebuking the disciples and specifically Judas for his comment. But the words of Jesus still rebuke us today. Jesus was stating that the poor will always be with you. Now, that wasn't like to say, well, Jesus was saying, well, they're always going to be with you, so what's the point? That's not what Jesus was saying. Jesus had shown throughout his earthly ministry that he cared generously for the poor. He fed the 5,000. He wept over them. He met their needs. But the reason why Jesus said these words is he wanted to show them that he was pointing to something else in the law of Moses. He wanted them to recall, and for us to recall, God's answer to poverty was not to be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards the poor. Instead, we are to be generous and lend them whatever they need. So the answer is to have a heart of love for the poor and not an attitude of superiority. You see, God's laws in the book of Deuteronomy, as you heard, was created in order to help alleviate systemic poverty within Israel. He places these laws in place because he understands that we as human beings, we live in a fallen world. And because we live in a fallen world, the strong will always take advantage of the weak. The rich will always take advantage of the poor. And because of this travesty, God reminds Israel that they are called to love their neighbors. They are called to love their brothers. And so they're responsible. God places that responsibility upon each and every Israelite that they are to care for one another and never to take advantage of another brother's sufferings. This was a key pillar, a hallmark of God's intended design for Israel's society. You see, because the rest of the world, they took advantage of the poor. They exploited them. They used them. But this was not to be the case for the nation of Israel, God's people. Israel was called to be a light to the world. When God spoke to Abraham, he said, "You would be a blessing to the nations." He reminded them about how they were to be set apart, a holy people. And as God's people, their first role and responsibility was to obey the commands of God. Meaning what? They love God. And if you love God, and if you're obedient to God, God promised them that He would bless them. He would take care of them. God promised that if they would take His commands seriously and look after one another, that God would be the one who would take account and remember and say, I am now going to bless you. And so, God knew that people were going to fall upon hard times. He knew that people were. So He makes a way. And that is why there were special provisions to have the poor cared for. Now, personally, I believe the big picture was that Israel was called to be a light to the nations. The big picture was for the world around Israel to see a flourishing society that was built on the love of God, and with that, they would have been that beacon of light to the world. Nations around her, scratching their heads, wondering why was Israel so blessed and at peace with one another. And I truly believe that if they would have lived up to what God had in store for them, that life would have been so attractive to a world that was hurting. And in the end, it would have been a witness unto God. Let me show you how a people of God live with one another. We love one another. We don't take advantage of one another, but we care for each other. And so God's desire for Israel was to be a thriving community of compassion. But did Israel live up to this? No. They wanted what they wanted. They wanted the ways of the world. So they broke covenant with God time and time again. They lusted after things instead of loving God and instead of loving people. And because of this, their society was not a healing society, nor was it a compassionate society. It became a society that was trapped in slavery, a society that was built upon taking advantage of others. And because of that, they became judged like the rest of the world. Take a look at the book of Amos. You can see how terrible within the very first chapter Israel had become. Amos goes up to Israel and he starts giving all these charges to the nations about how God is going to judge them. And then you imagine as they're hearing, yes, God is finally going to bring justice to us. And at the very end, Amos says, now it's your turn. You could see how terrible the nation of Israel had become. They had lost their land. God was upset with them. Why? Because of their lack of concern for the poor. They would bribe officials and judges. They would sell their poor brothers into slavery and collect their sandals to even sell that as well to make an extra buck. They sold off to make money, and they had become worse than the other nations around them. And so God judged them for that. When we look and we see Jesus' command to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself, it is a call to those who would follow after him to be a compassionate and caring people. Jesus reminds Judas, reminds the disciples and all those who were listening to remember my words. Be generous. Be open. Yes, the poor will always be among you, but don't be hard in your hearts. Don't be tight-fisted toward them. Don't have an attitude of despise and hatred towards them. But instead, be generous, kind, and loving. How does a church respond to such a command of Christ? Well, I believe that we let our love flow. As the prophet Amos thundered, and as we sang today, let justice roll like a river and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. If you read beyond or before that statement of Amos, you read that God wasn't very interested in Israel's religiosity. He wasn't interested in how many bulls they were sacrificing to him. He wasn't interested in any of those things because they did not have the right heart. They took the money that they made off the poor to go and buy a bull to sacrifice to God and say, God bless me. I'm following what you've asked me to do. They weren't following what God asked them to do. He said to care for the poor. God wanted changed hearts, and God still wants changed hearts. We must respond first within us. Our very nature of our person, if we are to be useful for the kingdom of God. Here's what Peter has to say. Looking back at Israel and looking at us as a church, but you are not like that, for you are a what? A chosen people. You are a royal priest, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. The church has the same call to the world. It's the same calling. To be a blessing, to be light, to be compassionate, to be loving, to stand for justice, to live in righteousness. And I love that Peter says, because you were called out of darkness into his wonderful light. And I think that when the church gets a hold of that and recounts, you'll begin to have compassion. Just as I had compassion for Jim. I didn't see that, oh, Jim had all this stuff and this junk that was all over him. Oh my goodness, I may get cooties. Instead, I could not help but run towards Jim and help Jim. Because why? You know what, Jim? I've been in the exact same situation that you have been. I know what it's like to be hurting. I know what it's like to be lost. I know what it's like to be sinful. I know what it's like. And because of that, the Lord brought me out of that darkness and changed me. But that doesn't mean that we stay right here. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean, well, I'm just going to stay in church and I'm just going to go and hear wonderful sermons and it doesn't mean that. It means we go out into the world. That's what we do. We're not called to be stagnant. We're called to be mobile. We're called to be the hands and feet of Christ and to show the world, look at what Jesus did for me. And if he did it for me, I know that he can do it for you. Do you remember, as we sang, do you remember the amazing grace that God had on your life? I know the author of that song did. A former slave captain. They said he was the worst of sinners. He even bragged about it. But when God got a hold of him, he wrote those beautiful words, "Amazing grace, that saved a wretch like me." I used to say wrench, but it was wretch like me. Do you remember that? You see, Mother Teresa, again, she said, the poverty of being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for is the greatest poverty. We must start in our own homes to remedy this kind of poverty. Church, we need to respond with the great commandment of loving God and loving people. We need to respond with that. I looked at some stats and I was amazed that within Christianity, over 30% of women have reported being abused by their Christian spouse. This should not be. It should not be. Like Israel, the church has been set apart and we are called to be a light unto the world. And if we look like the world and act like the world will not see the blessed hope that God gives. According to Stop Child Homelessness, approximately 63% of homeless women have been victims of domestic violence. Did you know that homeless children are more likely to suffer from hunger, poor physical and emotional health, and that 42% of children in homeless families are under the age of 6? 29% of homeless families here in America are headed by a working adult, usually the mother. Where does this all start? People just didn't blink their eyes and they ended up on the streets. The poverty, the homelessness, it all starts in the home. We have countless, I have been a witness, and some of you as well, where we've had women who have come in through these church doors looking for help because they've been abused physically at home. How do we stop this? It starts by loving one another. It starts with loving God. How do we deal with these things? How do we deal with homelessness? How do we deal with poverty? It starts with loving God and loving people. Take a look at your life. What are some things that need to change within you? Now, when it comes to homelessness, it's important for us to be educated so that we can take appropriate action. There are two types of homelessness. There's chronic and situational. Now, situational homelessness can happen to anyone here in this place. It's when a natural disaster strikes and you lose your home. A fire at the house burns everything up and you don't have insurance on your home. A loss of a job that can take place. These people don't want to be homeless, so they try and find a way out. That is situational homelessness. Chronic homelessness is a little bit more difficult to solve. And the reason for that is because that type of homelessness has become a lifestyle. People over the years have chosen to stay in this type of life. So what happens is they'll start here in Corpus Christi, use up all the resources. Once they can no longer use those resources, because those resources are put in place in order to help situational homelessness, they'll move on to San Antonio and do the same thing, and then come down to Houston and then do the same thing and come down. And this is all that it does because it becomes a lifestyle. I remember talking to a homeless man by the name of David. And I remember as I got to know him, I asked him, how come you're homeless? You're a smart guy. You know how to do stuff. You just didn't wake up homeless. What happened? I mean, you've got some skills here. And his answer to me was, I tried. I tried and I failed and I ended up on the street and I worked really hard to get back off the street. And then, I got back off the street and then it happened again. And I tried one more time and then it happened again. And so I don't have any hope. I guess this is just where I'm supposed to be. Now, there were some other things that were hindering him and how he dealt with his situations in life. But it became a lifestyle. And for some people, the root of poverty, it extends far beyond the need of clothing. They need Christ. Only Jesus can change the heart of a person. And so we are called to always plant seeds and water seeds. Some people that we encounter, they're not going to change. Or at least you may not see the change in your lifetime. But we're obedient to the word and we plant seeds and water seeds. We must realize that we are not able to help everyone. You and I, we cannot help everyone. That's why the church is everywhere. But you can help here. And how do you start? You start with yourself. By being the hands and feet of Christ. How do we do this? Well, we must remember that we are stewards of God. Peter tells us, each of you, look to your neighbor and say, that's me. Oh, we're very quiet. Reach to you and say, that's me. And then look to the other side and say, that's you. Okay, good. Got to keep you going here. Should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. Everything that you and I have comes from the Lord. Amen. Everything that you and I have comes from the Lord. So why are we so stingy with it? There may be some deeper issues within our life. That's why I said it starts first by looking at here in your life. Perhaps maybe the reason why we are so tight-fisted is because, well, if I give to everyone else, how do I know that God is not going to give to me? Maybe the issue is you really don't trust God. So I have to keep what's mine. Now, I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about abilities as well. God has equipped each and every one of us to serve. And when those opportunities arise for us to serve, we should say, yes, sign me up. I'm ready to go forward. But sometimes we just want to sleep in. I know what that's like, because sometimes I like to sleep in. But when these opportunities are available, we need to take the opportunity to serve. God has equipped you to serve. He's equipped you to do it. This isn't just about for taking. Give it to me. It's about being able to give. How can I help you? My friends, I'm not trying to brag, but I'm going to brag a little bit. My children know how to serve. They know. They know how to serve. And they do it with a cheerful heart because at a young age, we showed them this is how you serve one another. Taking them to El Salvador at a young age to go and serve. It's not uncommon for us to get an ice chest filled with water and go and pass it out to the homeless people in Corpus Christi. And my kids aren't like, I'm scared. No. Who's next? Look, there's somebody over there. Not afraid to serve. While I was gone for training for the Navy, they made sandwiches, or sometimes they'll make little baggies with toothpaste or stuff. Or, sometimes when you go to the dentist, and what do they give you? Toothpaste. And I already have this. But you know what? We collect those and then put them in baggies and then take them to homeless people. These are all little ways that you can help. Now, for starters, maybe you're like, well, I don't really know about that yet. Okay, but you can pray. How many of you on your way to church, you saw a homeless person? Anyone? I saw several. I'm keenly aware of homeless people. I'm not always able to stop, but I am always able to pray. Lord, I don't know what that man's situation is right now, but God, I ask, if there's a way right now, if I can help, then Lord, tell me. If not, Lord, I know that your people are here. You pray, you constantly keep going, because remember, prayer isn't just for them, it's also for you, to change your heart. When you see the panhandler, anybody ever see those? See those guys, ladies, standing there with a sign? How do we respond to that? Well, use wisdom. Allow the Holy Spirit to bring you discernment. But it's not uncommon. My kids would tell you it's not uncommon if there's not a bunch of cars around, rolled down the window. Hey man, we just came from eating somewhere. We have all this leftover food that we didn't touch. Do you want this? Yeah, bro, I'll take it. Yeah, here you go. And some of the nicest people you'll ever meet. Jacob and I, one time we were at Whataburger and somebody knocked on the door of our window and like, oh my goodness, who's this? And he's like, can I get something to eat? I said, yeah, man, we'll get you something to eat. There are people that God is going to place in your life. How will you respond? One of the ways that you can do this is by serving here at City Church. Yvette, say hello. Yes, everybody know Yvette? Waving in the back. You can take time to serve at City Church as a volunteer whenever we go to the food pantry of Corpus Christi, the food bank. That's one way that you can help. Whenever we do our Red Barrel ministry for the food bank, bring some groceries. One of the ways that we help one another is by signing up for meal trains. You can be a missionary with what God has given you. As I said, fill an ice chest up with water and have it in the back. When you see someone, man, if you got the here, man, I just bring you a water. Just want to let you know that I saw you today. It makes a difference in a person's life. Now, it's important for you to have some rules to follow. There are certain rules that I follow. One is I don't give out money. Now, sometimes I lie. I do break that rule. Sometimes I do. But again, I listen. Holy Spirit, is this something I should do? I'll always meet a person's need when they're hungry. If they come up to me and they say, I'm hungry, I haven't eaten, wait right here, I'll be right back. I got no problem doing that, helping someone who's hungry. I know what it's like to be hungry. The other thing that I have in the back of my head, and this is one of the things we're working on here at the church, is having a knowledge of ministries that can help. When someone comes up to you and they say, well, I'm really struggling right now because, I don't know where I can go to and get some help to get some groceries. Then in my wheelhouse, I'm able to say, hey, I know of this ministry. I know of this ministry. This is where they are. And point them in the right direction. One of the most important things that you can do is listen. Listen, and you may find that you two actually have more in common than what you think. I'm going to end with this, that we're all blessed. We're all blessed. The early believers took these teachings on being open very seriously. In Acts chapter 4, we read that God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that there were no needy persons among them. Because from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put them at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Now I'm going to say something bold, that there should be no poor Christians within our church. That should be unheard of. There should be no Christian brothers and sisters of ours that are in poverty. Like Israel, the church is called to care for each other. And we can help meet the needs of each other. We live in a wonderful time and are blessed to be here in this nation. Blessed. I've been to third world countries, and the poverty is terrible. We can help meet the needs of each other. There's no reason why our church members should be in need. We can help one another. It doesn't have to always be with money. But you know what? If you see a need and you can meet it, meet it. Maybe you heard about from your brothers that, you know what, our lawnmower broke and, my grass is growing so high. Well, not right now, because maybe after next week when it rains. But maybe you could say, you know what, I got a lawnmower and I'm just not going to let you use it. I'm going to come cut it for you. You can help that way. Because once you start to get to know people and build relationships with them, you get to know a little bit more about their life. And they may not go and stand out there and say, help me, help me. But because you know them so well, you'll be able to distinguish and pick up when they're saying help. And you can meet those needs. Maybe providing a gift card for gas. Whatever it may be. We can bless one another. And this is how the world changes. We just sang, by seeing how we love one another. We just sang that song. They're going to know us that we are Christians by what? By our love. Not by our fancy buildings, not by great, mediocre sermons, not by, look at all these wonderful instruments that are up here. It's not by those things. It's by our love. The love that God has given us and the love that we have for God, it translates into loving others. In Psalm 82, Asaph said this, give justice to the poor and to the orphan, uphold the rights of the oppressed and the destitute, rescue the poor and the helpless, deliver them from the grasp of evil people. And so as our worship team comes up, I want you to think about that psalm. We are called as a church to action, to act. We are called to give justice, called to uphold the rights of the oppressed, to rescue the poor, and to deliver them from the grasp of the evil ones. That's what we're called to do. As our prayer partners come up, I want to encourage you today. To ask the Lord to look upon your heart and be real honest. And ask the Lord if there's anything that needs to change within you. Because if we're going to make a difference, It's going to start right here with us. Now, some of you are, just because I know you, are extremely generous, loving people. And I can't say how thankful that I am for your generosity and for the love of God within your heart. Each of you has a calling. Go to the world. Be used by God. Use those talents that He's given you for His glory. The world needs you.